The silence in the ancient sanctuary was heavy, just a brief prelude to the destruction that awaited outside. The group advanced as a single unit. There was no time for doubt. The only option was to go through hell together. The ambush was immediate and merciless. From all directions, death tried to surround them, turning the corridor into a slaughterhouse. The air vibrated with the horde's screams, an endless swarm thirsty for blood that seemed to have no end. He ignored the noise around him, narrowing his focus. His mind locked onto a single objective: to clear a path at any cost. His blade answered his instinct, cutting through air and flesh in a fluid motion that the enemy didn't even see coming. Defying gravity, he calculated the perfect trajectory, turning the battlefield itself into his personal chessboard. The impact reverberated through his bones. It wasn't just a blow, it was an absolute sentence, against which there was no defense. The released energy was overwhelming, blasting the threat into fragments before it could even react. As the dust settled, he kept his guard up. One less obstacle, but the war was far from over. His instincts, sharpened by countless battles, warned him that the real danger had not yet passed. While he kept the vanguard busy, she saw the perfect opening to intervene. Her speed increased. She wouldn't let him take all the glory alone. Magical power began to bubble inside her, and the tension of combat gave way to a different emotion. The pure euphoria of imminent destruction made her smile. With a cry of pure ecstasy, she unleashed all the arcane power she had accumulated, regardless of the consequences. The resulting explosion not only hit the target, but swept the area with an overwhelming force. The impact was so violent that the very structure of the place began to give way, turning the ground into splinters. Amidst the chaos, her satisfaction was visible. Seeing the world crumble was exactly what she wanted. While destruction reigned, the healer stood firm, ignoring the debris flying around her to focus on her faith. She channeled her divine energy, desperately trying to protect her allies before it was too late. But her devotion left her vulnerable, and the beast took advantage of her lowered guard to attack mercilessly. The blow was fatal and precise, tearing flesh and brutally interrupting the prayer. The believer fell, but her final expression was not of fear, but of a serene acceptance of her fate. The death of his companion triggered the warrior's fury, who advanced, crushing the ground with heavy steps. Driven by uncontrollable rage, he prepared a blow capable of splitting mountains in half. The attack swept away the enemy hordes as if they were rag dolls, clearing the sector with pure brute force. The result was a visceral rain that covered the battlefield, momentarily silencing the opponents. For the valiant, this was not horror, it was fuel. The adrenaline of the slaughter made him smile diabolically. While the others watched the scene in shock, the rest of the group realized that the situation was completely out of control. Driven by grief for his fallen companion, he transformed his own body into a weapon of pure destruction. The numerical superiority of the enemies did not matter. His only goal was to eradicate everything in his path before they could breathe. The scream that tore through his throat only served to fuel the blind fury that took over his mind. It wasn't a battle, but a one-sided massacre, where he reaped the lives of the demons without the slightest mercy. For him, those creatures were stupid and pathetic, unworthy even of the effort of his blade. With the carnage over, he sheathed his weapon with disdain, barely considering it a warm-up. His ally, however, watched with concern, realizing that this recklessness hid a dangerous imbalance. The rest of the group remained static, intimidated by the display of brute violence they had just witnessed. He mocked the weakness of his opponents, letting his arrogance lower his guard for a brief moment. But the warrior's instinct screamed a sudden warning in his mind before he could finish the sentence. An unseen attack sliced through the air, too fast for the common eye to follow. The paladin sensed death behind him, but his body didn't have time to react. In a purely instinctive move, the warrior pushed his comrade away and took the fatal blow instead. The shock paralyzed the ally as blood spurted, sealing a sacrifice no one expected from that brute. And from the shadows, the true nightmare finally revealed itself, ready to finish the job. The blow was fatal, before he could even process the pain, tearing through his defenses and his hope. He collapsed to the cold ground while his ally just watched, powerless to stop the inevitable. The creature mocked their frailty, savoring the scent of fresh blood in the air. Giving no chance for mourning, the monster charged again, set on slaughtering everyone there in one fell swoop. But the swordsman wouldn't allow another death. He intercepted the attack with sheer defensive determination. The brute force of the impact hurled him back, testing every fiber of his resistance against the wall. Using that pressure as fuel, he channeled his fury into a lightning counterattack to turn the tables. The blade found its mark, punishing the beast's arrogance and tearing through its armor. The threat was repelled with a burst of power, buying a brief moment of safety on the battlefield. The rest of the group ran in despair, panic taking over as they realized the gravity of the situation. But as they gathered, the silence weighed heavier than any scream. The swordsman could barely face the price of that failure. His back to his friend, he gritted his teeth, consumed by the guilt of being a second too late. However, the fallen warrior felt no grudge. Even on the verge of death, he smiled to ease his companion's burden. With his last strength, he reached out a trembling hand, trying to touch those he loved one last time, until gravity overcame will, and his hand fell, leaving only emptiness behind. In that final instant, the firm grip sealed a silent promise, uniting the fate of two warriors through spilled blood. Faced with the imminent loss, the hero made a solemn vow, committing his very soul to eradicate all the evil that caused this. But the dying man found all that seriousness funny, smiling mockingly at death, as if it were just another bad joke. A final prayer was whispered, seeking peace for the one who fought so hard, even if acceptance was too painful. The powerlessness turned into a hard expression of someone trying to hold the world on their shoulders to keep it from collapsing right there. Meanwhile, sadness overflowed uncontrollably, washing over the face of someone who knew there would be no "see you later." In his last breath, he preferred to mock fate than say pretty words, maintaining his defiant essence to the end. But historical reality was distorted. He awoke in another life, kicking away the romantic and false narrative they invented about his death. The indignation made him tremble. The shame of having his last words turned into a fairy tale was unbearable. Reading the official record of the great adventures, he was incredulous to see that he was portrayed as a sentimental fool, and not as the warrior he was. The frustration was so great that the history book went flying. He couldn't understand why they left such an inaccurate account for posterity. The image of his former companions crying over his body was still vivid in his mind, a brutal contrast to the legend he had just read. The explosive anger soon gave way to reflection as he tried to process the abyss between the truth he lived and the lie that was written. A suspicion began to form in his thoughts, questioning the intentions behind that historical distortion. If they changed the end of his life, what else had been altered in the world during his absence? Before the imposing painting, he felt the weight of his family's history fall on his shoulders, recognizing the figure that shaped that destiny. That man was not just a distant ancestor, he was the standard of strength and leadership that he needed not only to reach but to surpass. The realization hit hard. The blood of that hero ran in his veins, and the responsibility to honor that legacy was now inevitable. With no time to waste on reveries, he began to prepare, knowing that the only way to prove his worth would be through brutal physical exertion. As he got ready, his mind went over the complex web of his lineage, understanding exactly where he fit into the family's power hierarchy. He chose his weapon naturally, although it was just a training tool. In his hands, it felt like an extension of his own body. Taking a deep breath, he focused, seeking to align the experience of his mature mind with the explosive energy of that youth. The first movement came with terrifying ferocity, channeling all his determination into a single descending strike. The applied force was so overwhelming that the air around seemed to tear apart under the pressure of the attack. The impact was devastating, making the ground tremble and give way under the sheer violence of that display of power. The instructor, who was only supposed to be supervising, felt a chill run down his spine. witnessing something that defied logic. With the target completely destroyed at his feet, the boy remained impassive, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He noticed the sudden silence and turned around, realizing he had gone a little too far in the demonstration. But the feeling of power was intoxicating. His muscles reacted perfectly, proving he was ready for much more than simple exercises. The man recoiled instinctively, terrified to realize that this monstrous strength emanated from someone who, theoretically, should just be a child. The instructor realized immediately that firmness in his voice and the oppressive aura did not belong to an ordinary child. Silence weighed between them as the man sweated, trying to process the absurdity of what he had just witnessed. But the boy wasn't there to chat. He channeled all his energy into a dry blow, shattering the wood as if it were a twig. The violence of the impact and the ease with which he destroyed the target surprised even himself for a brief second. Trying to regain his mentor's posture, the man cleared his throat, seeking to dispel the strange atmosphere and the tension that had settled in. There was no time to waste on hesitations, as the decisive day, the moment of truth, would arrive at dawn. The young man knew he needed to be focused, as this would be his only chance to change his destiny. It all came down to that crest, the symbol of power and glory that he so longed to achieve. To be recognized as a true member of the clan, rising above the crowd of candidates. The life of a Lionheart was forged in constant battle, and he had dedicated every drop of sweat to deserve that title. At the end of training, while catching his breath leaning on his sword, the reality of his social position weighed on his shoulders. The instructor observed the wreckage on the ground, recognizing the raw and terrifying talent he had just seen in action. The master's thought was bitter. How much potential was being limited just because the boy wasn't born into the main lineage? A wave of pity washed over the old warrior, lamenting the injustice of fate that bound that prodigy to a lower caste. But the young man, oblivious to this silent pity, only wondered at the sudden and melancholic change in his master's mood. The man tried to disguise the moment of weakness, wiping his face as if it were just a speck of dust or passing fatigue. But he soon resumed his rigid posture, barking orders to ensure that the boy's focus was not lost in sentimentality. Eugene just sighed, finding all that mood swinging from the instructor unnecessary and annoying. The mentor, however, needed him to understand the gravity of the situation, holding him firmly to force his attention. There was real fear in those words, the anguish of someone who knows that the world out there does not forgive mistakes, and that the boy's survival was at stake. To his surprise, all that tension was broken by a light and carefree laugh from the boy. Inside, Eugene's amusement was dark. That man had no idea he was trying to teach a monster how to survive. His attention turned to the motionless target. It was the perfect opportunity to prove that concern was unfounded. As he walked to the test, his mind coldly calculated the variables of the competition against the secondary families. He reviewed the list of opponents, aware that, in addition to the common competitors, he would have to deal with the prodigy twins. But strategy came later. Now, he just needed to let muscle memory take over. The blow was delivered with precise violence, obliterating the dummy's resistance in a single instant. The destruction brought a wild smile to his face. The old bloodlust from his past life was awakening. The preparation time was over. The carriage was now taking him directly to the center of power and family politics. Watching the main property approach, Eugene knew that the backyard training was in the past. The real game was starting now. The memory of who he used to be, an arrogant bully who oppressed the weak, was still a difficult stain to scrub from his conscience. He remembered his own insolence, how he responded to any attempt at guidance with vulgar insults and defensive aggression. But what really weighed on him was the disappointment in his mentor's eyes, who lamented seeing so much potential wasted by a lack of discipline. Back then, he shouted lies to himself, swearing he was doing his best, trying to justify the unjustifiable. It was the pathetic desperation of someone who refused to admit their own weakness, preferring to blame the world, rather than face their failures, and the only response he received was a stoic silence, the look of someone who had seen heroes born and knew that this boy was not one of them. That man had abandoned glories and titles, hoping to find a worthy successor, but had only found disappointment. Back in the present, the monotonous rocking of the carriage wasn't enough to ward off these ghosts that insisted on returning. His thoughts wandered to the sage, that insightful woman who would never tolerate such insolent behavior. He also remembered that holy figure whose purity and devotion always contrasted with the filth he felt he carried. And even the image of the great warrior, a symbol of bravery, seemed to appear to judge the path he was treading. Impatience began to manifest physically, a nervous tic paced by the anxiety of someone carrying too heavy a burden. Remembering those old companions and how things ended made his blood boil with an old and deep frustration. He had to use all his willpower to contain his fury, clenching his fists so as not to lose control right there. For deep down, the image that wouldn't leave his head was that last moment of vulnerability, a silent plea he could never forget. The landscape passed outside, but Eugene's mind was far away, focused on the approaching destination and the weight of what it meant. His attention was suddenly drawn back to the interior of the carriage, realizing he wasn't alone in his thoughts. The man in front of him maintained an expression of satisfaction, exuding a cordiality that seemed to test the boy's reactions. Eugene decided to play along, addressing Sir Gordon with the politeness expected of someone in his position. He flashed a radiant smile, masking any tension with the feigned innocence that the situation demanded. Gordon, however, found the moment opportune for a provocation, questioning why the boy would feel pride in something that, technically, didn't even belong to him. He continued with his sharp speech, suggesting that so much grandeur might be more of a nuisance than a blessing. Eugene maintained his friendly facade, agreeing outwardly while inside filtering the old man's sarcasm. The rhythm of the journey changed, and the sound of the hooves slowing down indicated that the final destination had been reached. Before them, the grandeur of the main headquarters was revealed, commanding respect and confirming the family's power. Upon touching the ground, Sir Gordon did the honors of the house, receiving him with a theatrical gesture in the heart of the territory. But the game was over for Eugene. He faced the place not with amazement, but with recognition. His eyes reflected an iron determination, ready to face any challenge that this house was holding for him. The majestic gates of the estate stand open under the bright sun. A silver-haired young man observes his surroundings with a look of skepticism. He walks along the paved path toward the grand castle, accompanied by an older guide. Blue banners, emblazoned with a golden lion crest, flutter proudly in the wind. The boy suddenly clutches his chest, feeling a sharp sensation within. Unaware of the boy's discomfort, the older man gestures broadly as he speaks. Inside the residence, a maid bows deeply and introduces herself as Nina. She smiles warmly, holding up a small bell for him to use whenever he needs assistance. Sitting on the edge of his bed, the boy reflects on the convenience of having a personal servant. When the topic of his age arises, he calmly states that he is 16 years old. A confident, mischievous smirk crosses his face as he considers his situation. However, his expression shifts to surprise when the maid asks an unexpected question. He leans forward on the bed, letting out a weary sigh of exasperation. Nina watches him with a startled and flushed expression, unsure how to respond. Outside, the stone towers of the estate remain silent beneath the blue sky. In the quiet courtyard of a grand estate, a young boy and girl stand together near a fountain, engaged in conversation. The boy raises a finger to emphasize his point, speaking with an air of authority and instruction. The girl listens intently, reacting with surprise as she absorbs his words. He teases her playfully, pointing out that she is far more accustomed to handling a garden rake than wielding a wooden sword. Unable to contain his amusement, the boy snickers at his own joke, finding the comparison hilarious. Far from being offended, the girl beams with admiration and cheers excitedly for her big brother. The siblings share a light-hearted moment, with the boy continuing his lecture while the girl giggles behind her hand. Unbeknownst to them, someone is watching their interaction from a high window in the mansion above. The two children begin to walk away across the pavement, leaving the observer's view. The observer's eyes widen, filled with a sudden, intense realization, as he takes in the scene. Inside the room, the boy stares at his reflection in sheer panic, shocked to find himself in a body he does not recognize. Outside, the silver-haired girl suddenly stops and turns her head, sensing the gaze from the window. She spots him and offers a sharp, knowing smirk, realizing she has caught his attention. Sometime later, the boy stands alone in the garden, preparing to practice martial arts, while a maid observes from a distance. He grips a wooden training spear tightly, sweating as he focuses all his energy on mastering the heavy weapon. The silver-haired boy lunges forward, thrusting his wooden spear with remarkable speed. He quickly recovers his stance, holding the weapon upright and steady. Moving with agility, he executes a rapid sequence of swings and strikes across the training ground. He puts his full strength into a wide swing, focusing intently on his technique. The spear slices through the air with a sharp sound as he follows through on the attack. His hands shift expertly along the shaft to maintain control during the rapid movements. He spins the weapon around his body, creating a defensive whirlwind with the spinning wood. A fierce, confident grin spreads across his face as he pushes his physical limits. Gathering his momentum, he delivers a crushing overhead blow that impacts with great force. He continues the drill relentlessly, transitioning fluidly between multiple combat stances. A maid stands quietly nearby, watching the intense training session from behind. Suddenly, she gasps and covers her mouth in shock, startled by an unexpected disturbance. A sharp voice calls out to her from the side, causing her to freeze in terror. Two students in uniform approach the trembling maid, looking at her with displeasure. Recognized and cornered, the maid cowers in fear and stammers as she faces them. The young noble asserts his authority, declaring that he is the one in charge of asking questions here. A wooden training staff strikes the ground hard, creating a cloud of dust and interrupting the confrontation. The boy holding the weapon looks up with an annoyed expression, asking if the noble is blind to the situation. He abruptly turns his body, swinging the staff around to shift his stance. The noble freezes in shock as a girl appears directly behind him, smiling mischievously while he tries to maintain his composure. Intense anger immediately boils over in the noble's expression as his patience snaps. He shouts loudly, clenching his fist and demanding to be heard. The boy with the staff simply offers a flat, unbothered apology for the interruption. The sudden, casual apology leaves the angry noble completely stunned and speechless. Regaining his fury, the noble begins shaking his fist and shouting at the other boy again. The boy with the staff lets out a weary sigh, looking unimpressed by the ongoing tantrum. The noble continues his lecture in the courtyard, screaming about the honor and expectations of the Lionheart name. The girl leans in close, her intense whispering startling the noble and cutting off his tirade. He quickly recovers and points an accusing finger, shouting angrily about the carriage that was used. The boy with the staff simply stares back, looking completely bored and unaffected by the accusation. A young boy stands alone in the training yard holding a wooden spear, acknowledged as young Master Eugene by the staff. He pauses his training, his attention drawn to the group of people approaching him. A visiting boy points an accusatory finger forward, shouting aggressively while the maids behind him tremble in fear. The visitor glares with intense anger, his eyes wide and glowing with hostility. Clutching his chest, he loudly declares himself to be Xian Lionheart. Eugene responds with a friendly smile and a wave, introducing himself casually as Eugene Lionheart. Beside the angry boy, a girl with silver hair waves happily and introduces herself as Xia Lionheart. Xian trembles with suppressed rage, clearly irritated by Eugene's relaxed attitude. His gaze falls upon a wooden training sword lying on the dusty ground nearby. With a swift motion, he reaches down and firmly grips the handle of the weapon. Surrounded by a fiery aura of indignation, Xian shouts that he has been humiliated. He brandishes the wooden sword and screams a challenge for a duel. Eugene watches the dramatic display with a smirk, finding the boy's behavior amusing rather than threatening. Eugene stands relaxed with his spear, facing down his armed challenger, while Ciel watches from the side. As Eugene sighs and rubs his forehead in exasperation, Kian taunts him by asking if he is afraid. The young boy focuses his gaze, his expression turning serious and cold. His opponent stands ready, brandishing a wooden sword with an arrogant grin. The white-haired boy looks confused by the sudden confrontation, holding his staff loosely. Impatient, the challenger points a finger and shouts aggressively, demanding a fight. In response, the boy begins to move, causing a sudden rush of air. While the challenger yells for them to start, the boy calmly begins untying the heavy weights secured to his wrists. With a sharp movement, he flings the loosened weight away from his body. He massages his wrist as the heavy training gear falls toward the ground. The weight plummets, carrying an unnatural heaviness. As it tears through the air, he releases the rest of his restraints, letting gravity take over. The weights slam into the courtyard floor with a thunderous crash, shattering the stone and stunning everyone present. The challenger's confidence vanishes instantly, replaced by cold sweat and fear as he witnesses the impact. Ignoring the shock of those around him, the boy calmly tightens his gloves and readies his spear. The girl watching from the sidelines beams with delight, her eyes sparkling with admiration for his hidden strength. Meanwhile, the challenger realizes he is outmatched, staring at his opponent with deep anxiety and regret. A furious young student prepares for a confrontation, gripping his training weapon tightly as sweat runs down his face. He throws a red cloth toward his opponent, shouting loudly to demand a formal duel. The opponent, armed with a spear, crouches down to inspect the challenge that has landed in the dirt. He looks up with a sharp, intense gaze, silently accepting the fight. A girl standing nearby watches the sudden escalation with wide-eyed shock. The spearman strikes instantly, thrusting his weapon upward and burying it deep into the challenger's stomach. The blow is devastating, knocking the wind completely out of the swordsman and leaving him gasping in agony. The sheer force of the impact lifts him off his feet and sends him flying helplessly through the air. He crashes violently onto the ground and slides backward, while the spearman holds his stance. The victor stands tall and composed, looking down at his defeated opponent without breaking a sweat. Panicked, the girl rushes onto the field to check on her fallen brother. She reaches him as he lies groaning in the dust, defeated at the feet of the spearman. Suddenly, the injured boy's face puffs up as a wave of severe nausea overwhelms him. He vomits uncontrollably, causing his sister to recoil in immediate disgust and cover her face. Thoroughly repulsed by the messy aftermath, she turns away sharply with a scowl. The girl shouts in protest, clenching her fist as she declares the situation completely unfair. Her outburst is met with silence from the boy, who stands with his arms crossed and an unimpressed expression. She presses the issue, pointing an accusing finger directly at him while demanding the truth. Frustrated, she yells that his claims about being from the direct line are nothing but lies. Her gaze intensifies, her eyes locking onto him as she tries to find any crack in his composure. A small, amused smirk forms on his lips in response to her scrutiny. He mocks her, noting with a sinister grin that her eyes aren't just for decoration after all. Despite the tension, he casually insults her, criticizing her crude manner of speech. The confrontation shifts to physical action as he swiftly drives a training sword into an opponent's stomach. He shrugs nonchalantly, acting as if the precise strike required no effort at all. His playful demeanor vanishes instantly, replaced by a cold and sharp glare. The struck opponent doubles over in agony, trembling as he retches from the impact. Collapsing to the ground, the defeated boy clutches his chest, overwhelmed by pain and humiliation. The victor stands tall with a bright, arrogant smile, seemingly proud of the brutal result. He begins to walk calmly toward his fallen adversary, ignoring the mess on the ground. The silver-haired boy stands over his defeated opponent, pointing down while the other boy looks up with vomit on his face. The boy on the ground sweats profusely, looking sick and humiliated as he tries to endure the aftermath of the fight. Looking at the mess he caused, The victor wonders to himself if he perhaps used too much force. A butler rushes onto the scene in a panic, shouting out for his young master as he sees the boys. The older man approaches with a stern and worried expression, focused entirely on the situation. The silver-haired boy watches the butler arrive, his expression remaining cool and detached. The defeated boy cries out in distress, tears mixing with the mess on his face as he reaches for help. The butler catches the collapsing boy, who clings to him and admits through sobs that he lost the duel. Buried in the butler's arms, the boy cries uncontrollably, dirtying the man's clothes with his sickness. The butler winces at the sight, looking deeply troubled by his young master's condition. Holding the weeping boy, the butler turns to face the silver-haired victor, the tension rising between them. The butler pauses to look at the boy in his arms, his face filled with concern and pity. The silver-haired boy speaks up calmly, answering the unasked question regarding who he is. He stands alone in the courtyard and states clearly that Sir Gerhard is his father. The butler is struck speechless, his face twisting in shock and nervous sweat at the revelation. The young boy begins to speak, asserting his position firmly. His younger counterpart shouts in denial while being physically restrained by the guardian. The boy stands his ground, mentioning that the offense also extends to his father. The guardian pauses, realizing that the boy's reasoning is actually valid. As the conflict ends, the guardian drags the protesting child, Cyan, away from the scene. The girl accompanying them waves cheerfully, promising to meet Eugene again next time. Eugene raises his hand to offer a short, indifferent farewell. Later, sitting alone in a large dining hall, Eugene eats his meal with ravenous hunger. He pauses mid-bite to address the maid, Nine, who is standing by. The maid looks surprised as she listens to his sudden words. Eugene continues to tear into his food, his mind drifting into deep thought. After finishing his meal, he pushes open the large ornate doors and steps outside. Standing on the bridge, he looks out at the sprawling architecture and speaks a single name, Vermouth. He leans forward, his expression sharpening with intensity. Eugene stands alone in the sunlight, contemplating the weight of the past. A hand reaches upward and clenches into a tight fist, grasping at the open sky with sullen determination. The young boy stands firm and confident, boldly confronting the frustrating reality of his new life.